Hello everyone, Jane Sanjaya from Parahyangan. Good luck everyone, have a good round.
Hi everyone, Arya from Telkom, good luck.
Hi everyone, Jessica here from USU. Good luck everyone.
Okay, before we start the debate, just a quick reminder for everyone. First of all, for the timer, you can just use the LO phone or just listen to the bell that is, yeah, I think LO also already borrow you the phone. And for the observer, please maintain the decorum. Please make sure that you keep turn off your mic, your phone's voice, and also please make sure that you not go outside or enter the room during the speaker when they speak. And please also maintain your voice, your facial expressions, anything that might be disturbing the speaker during their speech. With that being said, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to open the debate for this round. Here.
20 seconds to organize my notes. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's start this discussion by characterizing grief. Grief is an emotional process in which you process things that happen to you which may be sad and you need to move on from. What does this look like? This looks like, for instance, when your relative die, you feel a loss. You feel that all the pleasant experiences that you have had with them is no longer possible, and therefore you are mourning for that loss of possibility of future happy experiences with these people. But grief is also not strictly limited to the death of a loved one. It can also look like mourning for the fact that you lost your family home in a forest fire, or the fact that you broke up with your romantic partner. Now, two characterizations of grief that is that is important coming from opening government. One, it can be deeply affecting, as in you might lose some level of appreciation to all the good things that you have in life, because as humans we tend to overemphasize on negative feelings. We tend to overemphasize on loss. This is in part why we have such a strong loss aversion. We are very much more able to focus on the things we don't have over the things that we have. And two, grief is ultimately unpleasant for the person experiencing it, and also the person around it, because the person around the grieving person might feel unappreciated for the fact that they are there. They might be so consumed by this grief that, you know, hey, I want to hang out with you, I want to make you feel better, but you are so busy crying in your room that you don't want to go with me. So what is opening government trying to prove to you? One, that in a world in which society understands that grief can be a lifelong process, that you do not simply move on from, that it is not a temporary state like the Fury in Greek mythology, you will have one, better grieving process for the person grieving, two, better ability to appreciate the good things in life that you have. Let's start by establishing the status quo. What is the principal harm of seeing grief as an emotional temporary state? One, people will feel pressured to either suppress their feeling of grief or do tokenistic appreciation of the people around them, precisely because ultimately, if society agrees grief is a temporary state, if you fail to move on from it, you will become stigmatized. People will see you as someone who cannot move on. People will see you as emotionally immature, as emotionally incapable of appreciating them. What does this look like? For instance, let's say a relative of mine died. I choose to not have a social life for a while. Now, people will say, he cannot move on. He keeps doing this. Ultimately, less social interaction, less able to move on. Now, whereas under our world in which we acknowledge, hey, this thing, it can be a lifelong process, they might be better able to see that, okay, fine, he is not moving on, let's just leave it be. Grief is like that. And what this might seem unrealistic, but we already see this thing in real life, because every other emotion generally is not really perceived as something that you need to move on from. For instance, learning, obviously, right? You don't know something, you want to know something. We don't expect people to just bottle it up, deal with it quickly, and move on. We see, hey, this is a lifelong process. You will not be able to do it perfectly the first time around. You will not be able to do it quickly, but you will continue to doing it, and that is okay. With grief, what is the principal harm then? When you say grief is something that you need to move on, you might be driven towards overexpression. Have you ever heard of the phrase when you are emotionally inconsolable? Just let it out. Just deal with it quickly and move on. Later on, you will feel fine. But what if you don't feel fine? And precisely because grief is about loss of things that can be so deeply personally effective to you that it will be difficult to move on. And the principal harm here, it can be overexpression of grief. What is overexpression of grief? For instance, you feel really bad. People encourage you, oh yeah, go out, drink a lot. Overdrink, it's fine. You are grieving. This is a temporary emotional state. Just let it be. But this is unhealthy. Whereas under our world, in which you see this is a lifelong process, it's fine for you to take your time. People will be like, okay, you might not even want to express it right now. You can do it later. Yes, closing.
When I lost my grandpa, after 100 days, I still cry. Would you judge me as a terrible person?
Precisely because the world understands that grief can be a lifelong process, I will not judge you as a terrible person. Whereas if I and society believe that this is a temporary emotional state, we might be judgmental towards you. And that is why our world is better, because, hey, people can be allowed to take their time. People can be allowed to be grieving for a long time if their grief is that big, and they will not be stigmatized, they will not be punished. And well, you might say, but you are enabling people to be grieving for the rest of their life. Isn't that harmful? Would that make them less able to appreciate all the good things that they do still have? No. Why? Because when you force people to suppress their grief, when you force people to do tokenistic appreciation, they will feel resentful. If I have to hide the fact that I still cry over something that happened in my past, then I will feel, okay, these people, they might mean good, but they are forcing me to do emotional labor that I don't want to do. I will feel resentful, and this will ultimately negate anything that can, any sort of appreciation that I can give towards them. Whereas under our world, in which, people understand grief can be a lifelong process, I can say, well, they are understanding. I am not able to move on, and they are fine with that. And that ultimately leads to me being better able to perceive their sympathy. And humans ultimately want connections. Emotional states can prevent us from forming these connections, from understanding that, hey, people are empathetic towards me, I should be empathetic towards them. But when this empathy, which only possible when society perceives griefs as the lifelong process that it is, I am better able to feel that sympathy. I am more able then to give back to them. I am more able to say, okay, they are giving me a lot. They are allowing me a lot of grief that I know is unpleasant towards them, right? Now I can better able to isolate that feeling, and I am better able to say, okay, it's time to move on. See, under our side of the world, it is so much healthier. You don't have that principal harm of, bottle it up, deal with it quickly. You are allowed to take your time, you are allowed to process it as the complex emotional thing that it is, and ultimately, when you take more time, you are better able to deal with it. Why? I might not have the emotional maturity to deal with the death of a loved one right now, but in 10, 20 years, when I meet more people, when I have met more people who have dealt with that emotion, I might have better emotional capacity to finally process that and put a cap on it. Or, maybe I won't. Ultimately, it is so much better. You don't have all the answers right now, and in our world, that will be fine. You can answer it at a later date. Very proud to propose.
I thank to the Prime Minister for that speech. Now I'd like to invite Leader of Opposition, Xie.
Trigger warning if I would say something offensive, because this is a personal motion. just for the purpose of debate. As opening opposition in this debate, we want to support the status quo and we want to oppose a kind of world that governments want to prefer in this debate. So therefore, before going to my contribution, let us compare how government's world that I prefer look like and how the current world that opening opposition wants to support looks like, right? If grief is perceived as a lifelong process one must go through in their lifetime, what this is look like in their government world. First, it means grief will penetrate all their life aspects on their daily basis. It means it will influence everything that you do on a daily basis. For example, how you decide your choice to live and how you live your life. It will be vastly influenced by this very grief, right? But also then, if this grief is vastly, perceived by the world, that, this is a lifelong process that everyone must go through, it means not only someone will be sad, but also everyone in their world will also be sad and grievous at the end of the day, right? Therefore, everyone will feel that in order to live, right? But then it will become a very problematic standard of their own, right? Because in order for everyone in their world to live, right, they have to grieve, they have to feel this grief. It means it will result in comparing each other's grief, for example, that everyone must go through. This is something very problematic. We will prove to you on my contribution why then humans' capacity to experience and perceive sadness is different, therefore this cannot stand. In opposition's world, why this is better? Because everyone will know that everyone has their own pace, has their own time of grief. And each of one has their own different, time of grief at the end of the day, right? Because if you perceive this grief as something that one day will subside, it means it will be abstract to everyone. It can be 1 year ahead, it can be 2 years ahead, and so on and so forth, according to their own time and pace, right? This is according to the human nature that is dynamic and unique, for example, in processing grief, and maybe accordingly to the brain cells or hormones that are different from one another, so on and so forth, we want to cater that. This means people will believe that even if at one point you are grieving, you can stop one day, you can move on, but maybe not now. You don't have to do it now, but chill. The ending will be happy, you will move on, this will subside at the end of the day, because this will result in self-fulfilling prophecy. If I'm sad, then yeah, it is self-fulfilling prophecy that I will move on, yeah, at the end of the day. Therefore, going to my contribution, why then the current status quo is better and we want to support that? Explained by 2 layers. One, the first layer is about principality. I think human is a complicated being to experience complex emotion. At one time, even you can feel both. For example, in a certain situation, maybe you can feel grief at the time, but right after that, you can feel happy just because of the characteristic of the situation, right? But the main conclusion is, at the end of the day, everyone's capacity to process grief is very different according to their own, for example, upbringing, characteristic, and how they, for example, personally perceive how sadness is, right? Why this conclusion and statement is important? Because we have to perceive grief as something subjective, right? Because one person may go through grief and one may not. Therefore, if you want to, for example, make this as a standard for them to live in this world, this will be very problematic. How can you cater everyone's personal, unique way to process sadness, right? But also, two, since you also can hide your grief, it will lead to a different coping mechanism of everyone, right? Because everyone will think that maybe if I am sad, I should, for example, tell everyone about it and ask for their solution. But some of them do not. Some of them will favor, for example, solitude and not displaying their sadness at the end of the day to their own people. We want to champion the idea that this grief is a very individual and a personal thing that should not be, societally generalized as to, at the end of the day, everyone will feel sad, right? But we think that in our opposition's world, this is an individualistic world. People need, for example, to self-defend their own way of coping with the sadness and weakness, right? This is what we want to support as the vulnerable actor, as an individual in this world that we want to support. That is why the grief cannot be perceived as a process one must go through in their lifetime, right? Because what? Because If this stance, this view requires external judgment as to whether they are grievous or not. This will backlash the very principle that you need to agree that humans' capacity to experience and to give meanings to sadness is different from one another. We don't want that external judgment. At the end of the day, we'll have the capacity to dictate as to whether or not you are grievous, and if you are grievous, for example, you have lived your life, because in their world, that this grief will be perceived as a lifelong process that one must go through in their lifetime, for example, right? Notice this judgment, external judgment of everyone towards individual sadness is only exclusive under government's world. But before I explain to you the practicality argument, why then under government world is worse and why then our world is structurally better, I need POI. One.
Under our world, people who take a long time would be fine, whereas under your world, people who take a long time will not be fine.
This is the problem of government, right? Because they never explain to you what kind of sadness that people cannot move on, what kind of sadness that people can move on. If they think that sympathy is exclusive under their side, sympathy also exists under our side, right? Because at the end of the day, sadness one day will subside. But we'll explain to you later as to why then the mechanism of sympathy can also exist under our side. Be patient. Practicality. We think that the issue is clear. A lot of people are actually harmed by sadness, right? For example, if sadness is perceived as something persisting that you need to go through for your lifetime. For example, you cannot make a good decision making because you are constantly stressed. For example, because you have to go through that sadness in your lifetime, right? For example, especially the grief that is derived from other people's wrongdoings from you, it will lead to, for example, a constant vengeance, a constant friction, tension to other people, right? Why then this makes government's world much worse under the head of the house? Because in the government's world, their world will be worse off, because everyone will feel the sadness that is accumulative. Their world will be structurally worse. Why? Because all people in their world can barely cooperate. Why? Because, for example, they can be influenced by the constant vengeance, because this sadness derives from the other people's wrongdoings, and they think that this vengeance persisting, right? But they cannot also decide something that is good, because it will also be heavily influenced by the subjective measures, which is sadness. Oh, sorry, I cannot make a good decision making because, yeah, I still feel sad at the end of the day, right? But at least in our positions world, sympathy will also exist. Why? Because people will tell you that this sadness will subside, you can move on, but maybe not now, chill, you will have a happy ending. Therefore, people are still as happy under our side of the house. Therefore, we want to oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. For that speech, not like to invite DPM. Here.
Entire OO's case is precisely relying on how people will then feel sympathy for you when you are grieving. And they mentioned to you how then individuals' process of grieving should not be compared to everyone else. And precisely it is because it is personalized. Precisely because it is personalized, we should not put a cap, a time limit on it, because it is not in a vacuum either, because there are also other narratives that tell you, for example, that you want to be happy in life. People always, it's human nature to strive for happiness, so it's not as if you will necessarily always be super depressed or anything like that, but also on how you can also should perhaps achieve other things in life, or maybe you also find other things in life that you can also be happy about, but we're not forcing you to actually move on and stuff like that, right? But why is it then that sympathy or compassion and stuff like that is not enough? Let's look at current status quo. People believe that it will subside one day, and in fact, people do give a time limit. Like people saying that, hey, you need to keep up in life. Time does not wait for anyone. This is like when people force you to keep on going. This looks like your family, your friends, your teachers, your peers saying that like, hey, you shouldn't just wallow on this. You'll miss out on the fun things in life. You'll miss out on this, on that, and this. You'll miss on your education. You'll miss on your teenage years and so on. And for example, on how current status quo, literal jobs and education systems will give you a time limit to grieve. For example, like a week. You can only leave for a week to grieve. You can only leave for a week to go to the funeral. But then I expect you to be in tip-top shape next time I see you. This is precisely the type of things that we don't want in a government side. But here, they try to say, for example, you will like start to, everyone will like grieve and compare grief. I don't understand this. I think generally people already understand that you have different connections with people. For example, I personally, as my own daughter, my own mom, I would grieve more than, for example, maybe like my cousin, you know, because like I definitely, we're not going to compare grief because it's literally different, right? So I don't see why it's going to be like comparative then. But then they mention how it's going to influence everything in life. I say that, sure, it will influence your life in the way that you also appreciate other people around you. For example, if I lose my mom, I will also, for example, appreciate my dad better. Like if I lose my wallet, someone stole it, I will better take care of my wallet because I don't want to lose it. I don't want to go through, for example, the same guilt that maybe I should have spent more time with my mom. I should have treated my mom better in the way that, for example, now I will treat my dad better. If I lose my friend, I will treat everyone that I make friends with so much better, but sure.
If you agree with us that everyone has their own personal space to feel sad, it means freedom of choice to feel sad. But why do you only prefer lifelong process everyone must go through their lifetime? What if there is someone who doesn't want to persist in their sadness in their lifetime?
I think the fact that your vulnerable actor is people that want to grieve compared to the people who are currently grieving. I don't know, I don't understand why they're significantly important where the ones that are hurting right now are the very people that you're like making even worse on your side. But look, okay, even if they want to tell you, for example, that people don't want to grieve, I think it is like still okay because like you can just say that like, oh, like I used to be here, but now I'm like much lower where I can again, I can appreciate it. The way that I process my guilt, my grief, is the way that I appreciate other people around me. For example, on how you say that it influences everything. I agree that grief influences the way you appreciate on how you live your life then. But here, then, why is it that we get worse off experience of like appreciation and things like that? Because when you force yourself to, for example, like get over, I think the type of like things that you do, for example, is like I need to do it rather than I want to. Principally, intent is as much important as impact. For example, if like a dad is caring for a child while like suppressing his grief, for example, for like losing his wife, he feels like he needs to take care of his child rather than because he wants to, because of his emotional state. Notice that he might not have the emotional capacity to do it, and precisely these kids would obviously also like necessarily like, you know, and also like feel his intent that he doesn't necessarily want to take care of her, but then in our world, maybe he might be more, she might be, or like the child might be more understanding as to why this is currently being done, right? Because when your expectation is for you to get over it quickly and just suppress it and get it over with, is then when you, for example, tend to like opt into a worse off intent where like I just do it because of its responsibility, but I don't feel like I want to or I feel loved, right? But then this is what is the practical harm of this as well? I think it's more likely when you suppress yourself and things like that, you're more likely to be more stressed out, more likely to be like messing things up and stuff like that. This could also, for example, impact the people around you, like you mess up for your kids, you mess up. But then onto some, as opposition tried to mention, how people perceive guilt or grief differently. I think you could also, for example, when you suppress yourself, it's likely for you to also blow up. This means blowing up on lashing out to the people around you, even to your child and things like that. Comparatively under our side, I think when everyone is more understanding that, you know, it is a lifelong thing, they are also could be more compassionate and understanding. For example, I might actually like, for example, let me like take care of your kid or something like that, rather than expecting you to just like, hey, it's your responsibility, you have to get over it anyways because it is your responsibility, it's your child. But here, even if it's like slow, I think it's preferable because I think our grief can be more spread out. As in, I don't have to focus all of my mental capacity to only focus on this one thing and only focusing on trying to get over it. Whereas I can, for example, one, process my emotions better and more healthily, as in, like, I do understand I need a long time to do this. That's why I will spread it out more equally. This is precisely the type of thing that we want, right? Because we understand that if you, for example, like suppress it or get over it so much, like it's likely that you will never be fully healed, and other people will also not try to make sure that you are actually trying to be fully healed and get over it slowly, where they're only basically badgering you and telling you you should just hurry up and do it so that you can, you know, do other things and so on. But I think that when your mental capacity is not only focusing on only getting over, you could also focus on other things, as like maybe like taking care and appreciating other people around you. For all of these reasons, so proud to be in SEMIs. Thank you.
Thank you, DBM, for that speech. Not like to invite DLO to close the opening half. Here.
I think there's a strategic world illustration in opening government, because they manifest a world where grief is perceived as a lifelong process, but they're missing the wording of the lifelong process one must go through. I think that this is a missed case, which means that they cannot justify any kind of that benefit, because under their side, the framing of my first speaker is the most relevant thing, where people are going to be perceived as that their life will qualify as life of human, they will qualify as human as long as they experience grief. We don't want to standardize any kind of grieving at one pace and at one time, because everyone's way to express their grief is different. But let's engage to opening government first. I think that there's a very huge contradiction in their side of the house, because eventually if they want to manifest a benefit of long life process of grief, but I question why then the harm that they broke is overexpression of grief, because overexpression of grief is a subject and is related to the subjective capability to process grief, right? So why that this is harmful if you want a long life process? We think that this is exactly how then the standardizing of the process of grief to everyone will manifest in their side of the house, and people will judge you based on whether or not you can show your process in front of everyone. And we think that when you can, we think that the one that is more harmful in this case is the one who are actually isolating their grief, and I think that this is the most common case in the current status quo. So I think that this debate should talk about how then grief is perceived and what is exactly the standard of grief, when grief will subside, when people will move on, and when it's fine. Why then the grief should be perceived as an emotional state that one day will subside, because your one day is different to everyone, and everyone will believe this and also believe this is the truth, because eventually you know that maybe tomorrow you can feel happy and you can be subsided from grief, but you also know that maybe one person one day is never going to be alive, or maybe one person one day is going to be 10 years in the future. That's why one can be grieving when I'm alone, but when you are happy with the people, for instance, and I think that this is justified. That's why I will bring two things here. Number one, I'm going to talk about to be perceived as human. Number two, I'm going to talk about the vulnerable people. All right. First thing, I'm going to talk about how then humans should be perceived as someone who is multidimensional and have a very kind of abstractness. This means that in opposition world there will be two things. In government world, there will be two things. Number one, in order to be able to qualify as truly living, you have to grieve. This is not the case, because not all people eventually also grieve. Maybe there are some people that doesn't actually overcome to actually face their trauma or severe problem in their life yet. But if they are not qualified, they are not grieving yet, which it means they are not actually experienced living, and they are to not be able to sympathize with everyone, and you will be perceived as so. We think, and they will be qualified as someone who doesn't actually deserve their happiness because they are not grieving yet. Because this is the comparative of, because how then people will be perceived that you deserve happiness if you already experience grief. We don't want this kind of thing because it dehumanizes the multidimensionality and abstractness of human in the end of the day. But secondly, we think that there will be an inherent cognitive dissonance in government world because human is very dynamic, right? If suddenly one person have their grief suddenly stop, for instance, there will be a bout of confusion. Why is that the case? Because you always hear that grief is something that must be something that is processed for a long time, which means that if this comes to a confusion to yourself, you will be very cruel to yourself and thinks that you are a dysfunctional person because you think that everyone has to go to this grief for a long time, and it's unfair for you to be happy because your grief is very short anyway. This is why dehumanizing humans and people in government will be much more severe, right? But what is the comparative under opposition world? Three structural things here. Number one, even if the grief will take a long time, this is fine because at one day it can suddenly disappear and maybe one day will come later, which means that people will have more incentive to actually give more space to others because you don't know when this grief will subside, but you know that you can move on, which means that this also gives more incentive for people to move on. Why is this important? Even if so let's take the OGs under our worst case. Even if we will be limited in our time to grieve, this is okay because it will subside one day. Human is dynamic. If it's truly limited, you will search for ways to cope. For example, you will choose to go to psychiatry so that you can find a way for grief to subside, process, and move on. But two, people will understand because grief can subside. That means you have the incentive to be a companion, for instance. This is how in our status quo, that is an individualistic world, the perceiving of grief as something that will subside one day can be an incentive for people who are individualistic to actually be able to be a companion, right? Why is this the case? So this is going to undermine second comparative, why empathy will manifest in our world. Understand that empathy is a process of where you can put yourself in other shoes. The only way to do this, if you understand the multidimensionality of a person, that people will go through any grief and any emotion that is very dynamic and very cannot be determined where their grief may manifest, right? For example, maybe you will break down one day in the middle of the street because suddenly you remember that you can no longer see your parents. This means that grief is also something that can be that can kambuh, for instance, which means that if you know that grief is something that can abstractly appear, you are likely to empathize with people who have this, right? But lastly, the very last comparative in our world, we think that these perceivance go hand in hand with the current empowerment narrative. For example, the love yourself narrative that tells us that you have to love yourself and value yourself regardless. You might grieve, you might never grieve, but regardless, you have to value yourself and you are allowed to be happy and not to be cope with grief. This is also very important for vulnerable actors because you know that minorities who are constantly oppressed, among these minorities, not everyone looks sad, right? Still, there are a lot of people that can still go through daily life. We think that the empowerment of minority, both individually and collectively, can only happen in opposition world when you have the prerequisite of this empathy to manifest. But secondly, you also can go hand in hand with the current empowerment narrative that can go with individuals, but also for the collective society. That's why we are very proud to oppose.
Thank you, DLO, for that speech. Now I'd like to invite member of GAF. Here.
Tes, okay. Our team identity is clear. We believe that grief and love goes hand in hand. What is lacking in the opening debate? They lack the process of grieving and what is the key difference of perception. Understand that perception doesn't only come from external society, but it also happens when you look in the mirror and how you perceive that grief in itself. First, I'm going to talk about OO. They say that in their world, moving on is something that is exclusive and better in your side. I'm going to engage on this, why a process is much more better on moving on. However, the depiction of it would be different, but it's going to, because you said that grief is actually influencing every aspect of your life. That is exactly why we want it as a process and not something that will eventually subside. Why then, who are these actors that we want to protect, right? Understand that, let's backtrack and let's not talk about society, right? Because I think grief is very private. Let's talk about how you as individuals look in yourself when you found that you got sad news that your parent maybe died, right? Also, I'm going to talk about how then minorities who are currently oppressed, or maybe those who are, how they perceive grief as something that is a lifelong journey. It's going to be better in our side. Now, what is the framing in this world, right? I believe that what is grief if it's not love persevering, right? Understand that love is inside grief in itself, and if you want grief to be something that is only emotional state, you are letting go all of that love and memories that you had with that person, right? If we can prove this, that it's better to be perceived as a process, then opening can't win because their analysis would be highly contingent to our principal argument. Going on then, what is grief? It's a private emotion that we hold close compared to sadness that we can share easily. For example, it's easy for people to say that I'm sad because the cafe that I wanted to go is closed, compared to that I lost my mom 7 years ago and I still mourn that she's not here with me. Because grief is something that is private, we characterize that the most vulnerable actors in this motion is yourself, and this perception heavily impacts the way you treat yourself or the decision to move on. Not because there is external pressure coming from society like OG said, but we're still going to engage why then it's so important. The perception of society is going to influence how you're going to change or how you're going to appreciate those memories, right? First, why the lifelong process is needed for grief, right? People won't view it as something that is a temporary state, but rather something that sticks with you and is a part of you. And I think this is something that is lacking from OG. They only said that grief is something that everyone experiences, but understand it's actually emotion that everyone experiences, and it's something that you cannot just quickly subside and just let it go, right? It's perceived as a process because the point is we don't want you to rush and get over it, right? We want you to get back to normal, but there is another way and safer way on how you can move on and interpret your grief in a safer and in a mentally healthy way, right? As an individual, you will accept the reality and that there will be days where you thought that you have moved on but haven't. You have accepted this from the very beginning because of this perception. The truth that from the beginning, it's a process. It's a long one. It won't be easy and it won't be quick, right? Even though the emotion of grief hurts, but because if it's a process, you allow the recognition that the level of your feelings will fluctuate every now and then. So what then is the difference? In their side, grief is perceived as a state, something temporary that will eventually disappear. The harm in their side, when a person is grieving, it's worse because they will keep on waiting for this day. They can ultimately move on and forget. That feeling of expectations that you put on yourself is an unnecessary burden that you have to hold. You already had the process of grief. You do not need to put that in an emotional state anymore, right? So then, in an individual level, you will expect yourself to quickly get it over with whenever you experience grief. This perception is clearly harmful because you add that burden. Yes?
But how about other grief that is not hand in hand with love, i.e. you are sad because you are oppressed, because you are tricked? Where do you want to choose to go through it your lifetime?
Understand that life isn't only about grief and anger and all of the negative emotions. Even if you are being oppressed, understand that maybe in your life, in that state, you have that one special person where you can move on and you can have strength, right? I don't think so in this world, whenever you're oppressed, you only live by yourself alone. But even if you are, understand that life isn't only about the sadness and all of the negative side. You can still find beauty and love everywhere you go. It doesn't have to be from humans. You can still still be grateful, living by your life and still healthy, even though, yes, you are being oppressed in that state, right? But then I'm going to focus on how then the process of moving on is going to be better in our side, right? When you face yourself to view grief as something that will subside, you're trying to let go, and maybe to the extent of forgetting the love that you have towards that person or towards that situation. This is exactly why we prefer people to perceive it as a process, wherein some days you mostly remember the good days, but then you also remember their absence in your life. This engages to OO's concern about those who don't want to grieve in a lifetime, right? Understand that grieving someone isn't always negative, which is exactly what your POI said, because it's a process. Individuals will have the time and space to interpret their feelings towards the emotion. Understand that feelings and emotion is different. Emotions is something that is factual, but feelings is something that you can manipulate, and that's something that you can actually, it can be sometimes contradicting, right? Something that is something traumatic, but then in the process of grieving, you understand that like, oh, okay, I learned something when I was being quote unquote oppressed, or maybe something that I was in a traumatic in a state. I learned something that is very valuable to my life, and I'm going to use that to change for myself to be better. I'm not going to choose my grief to be the depiction of my life. I'm going to use that as a force so I can be better towards the future, right? Comparatively, in your side, individuals will only focus on how to get it over with without acknowledging the other feelings with your life in that current state, right? With the process of a lifetime, the picturization of moving on is clear on our side. It's not something that is instant, but you also talk about the good memories with your loved ones, right? Understand that as you live your life, that's when you move on and truly accept the reality without the expense of forgetting or maybe forcing yourself to even go to the extent that you want to forget all of the memories and all of the love that you have experienced with that person or in that state. Then what comes after moving on? That's when you have sympathy, right? Because you have experienced that, you realize when you use that grief, you use it for your strength, you use it to utilize and be a better person, and that's how you can connect to other people. That's where the communal actors comes in, right? Which is why our actor analysis of individuals is so important. When you have that perception of yourself of how to grieve in a process, then and only then you can help other people to process all of those emotions in the future or in a communal state, right? So what is our contribution? Our biggest contribution is we have answered the burden on how grief is also about love and something that individuals must do, and we have engaged to OO's concerns, and we also have picturized how moving on is something that should be a process and why it's going to be beneficial. We are proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Member of Government. Now I'd like to welcome Member of Opposition. Here.
Audible? Okay. Just to trigger warnings, number one, this debate contains really a lot of sensitive content, so yeah, probably anything that I just say during the debate is not representing my personal points of view, but rather just for the sake of the debate. Secondly, yeah, as usual, POI from either bench, whoever first. Okay, I'm just gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Government bench built a draconian world where people that born with strong mentality, born under the conditions of prosper family, and live a utopia life get praises. While the one who needed the most were stepped down right on the face, saying that, Jason, you are weak because you cannot move on from that, from your beloved grandma. The difference in either side is that CO will identify the coercive power from state or society to impose the narrative. Because look at the wording motions. Governments say, and they must defend narrative, a word that contain must. That means everyone must oblige to move on under their sort of house. They do not have anything else to do to relieve their grievances, because if not, then state or society will condemn or gaslight or even use forces for them to eventually move on. The narrative that opposition must defend is just a narrative that contains one day will subside, not must subside. Therefore, this is where our arguments matter, because I feel like opening explained about choices, but CO will eventually identify the accessibility and why not everyone can eventually move on, mechanizing opening oppositions and and prove the comparative where inside of government the process is going to be extremely worse. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the macro policy inside of this debate. The first thing that I want to talk about is accessibility. How is the process of delivering the narrative in government manifest that? Because they must prove and package this as if it's a long process to move on. Therefore, you must have a really, really strong mentality inside of your personal capacity. How does this look like? One, since kid, you will be injected by some kind of narrative saying that emotion is not useful. You cannot mourn when your kittens are dying. You cannot cry when you lose a certain competitions. This will obviously be done by a lot of individuals like your parents when they do not want to have children that are crybaby with the picturizations that government themselves bring. Because if not, then parents will live ashamed under this sort of house. Because from the vast majority of their life, they have been indoctrinated that having kids that say crybaby and so on are probably something that is considered as not virtuous in the society. Therefore, even since you were kids, you allow some kind of painful childhood to eventually appear to disallow your emotions to pop up. But secondly, the grieving is a constant process, right? I think like it will relapse some time because it left strong impression in your mind because the memories, the moments, and the sweet sleep call that I had with my ex-partner always haunts me all the time. This is the reasons why under this house, you will oppress these particular individual who are the subjects of your grievances by constantly gaslighting yourself that she was not that pretty, she was not that cute, that eventually make constant moral dilemma that appear under the side of government that feel as a painful alternatives. But secondly, I feel like also in order for you to move on, and this is the mechanism that opening oppositions forget, you must remembering and over-exaggerating the bad memories or moments inside of your mind to eventually overwhelm the good memories that you have been made under their side of the house. That allows individuals to have bad impressions from the people that left behind. Therefore, they do not have any alternative to opt out, especially when their alternative in closing government is trauma and grief. Therefore, all of this flip the vast majority of closing government claims that the memories that left behind under closing government cannot left good impressions, cannot left good narrative. But thirdly, I'll put on the comparative because the way that people cope are obviously remembering good memories. This will eventually engage with side of closing government because this exclusive mechanism does not appear in opening oppositions. Because I can only accept my fact that my mom passed away only if I do remember all the good facts about her. She left legacy to me. She left impressions. She left narratives and values and so on. I remember my mom when I saw a lot of memento that trigger my memories, that you will find this everything in your home and so on. The pics of my childhood that will eventually haunt me and so on. But the difference is that closing oppositions identify the narrative, that the process of subside does not mean that you will entirely forget everything, like what opening oppositions explain. But subside means that whenever there are memento that appear inside of your mind, that triggering your memories, your initial response will not sadness, your initial response will not grievances, but rather remembering good impressions that my mom taught me since I were kids. Therefore, the comparative is that during grieving in their sort of house, you must eventually get help from everyone to encounter the negative energy and the negative memories that left behind. But however, it is harmful in their side because now the closest relations that is impactful to help you from coping this will become the main enemy to gaslight you to move on that makes you even more hateful and negative. This is the nuance impact that only closing oppositions prove. Because I would argue that you can also have a lot of grievances at the same time. When government bench add more nuances, when your community become far more alienating you from the process of grievances, therefore you are likely to hate them even more under their sort of house. Therefore, what's happening is that their side actually elevate burdens from people to move on because now not only they need to face their trauma, but also they need to face their own alienating community. Therefore, they leave people with tension, stress, and depressions on their side of house that left no room of happiness. But secondly, we explained that we can change that good memories under our side of the house the moment when community become an actor that is not alienating you in the first place. How does this manifest? This manifests into a lot of compromise that community will eventually make during that process. Therefore, what we are proving is that your community will be the actor that will help you to gain through this process. Opening.
Opposition is operating under a very uncharitable interpretation of must here. Must means it must be dealt with, and precisely because people recognize it must be dealt with, they will give you more space to deal with it.
So what's your output then? Because if that's the case, then the community will still eventually help them in our side of the house. The difference is that how powerful state or community or that society to impose this certain helps to you as an individual on our side, they will only help us if we allow them to help us and if we give consent for them to help us because we eventually allow them to intervene in our personal spaces. The second thing that I want to talk about is macro policy because the intergenerational trauma that closing government brings and so on is going to be worse on the rest of the house. Why? Because one, the memories that now will will subside in minorities' perspective only could happen when you receive this certain level of satisfactions. This only can be happen when minority feel that there is a certain accepted policy that government must make, or a lot of alternatives and approaches that they must have done through campaign or policy making. That allows this to appear is only the forms of emotions. Under our side of the house, insofar as you do not gaslight people to actually shut down their emotions, then at least this act for more room of space for minority to do healthy discourse by allowing multiple spectrums of discussions of discriminations to appear. But what happened under their side is that the government will eventually have the incentive to override this narrative, saying that minority can just endure this oppression because you are the one who eventually deserve this. Therefore, the narrative that appear under government bench will be the narrative that will be wave-rided by all the bigoted and conservative narrative. Therefore, the weighing is clear. The individuals in our side of the house, especially minority, have different spectrums. In most cases, we can argue that minority must feel emotions in order for them to achieve subside. And this is what perpetuates even more movements, even more demonstrations, and constant policy changes in our side of the house. But even if minority wants to forget in worst case, that's fine, because I would argue that they do not have any energy to do all of that. Therefore, at least the choices are important. We are far more upper hand than opening because we are the one that mechanize how the memory is manifested and how does this left impression to people.
Thank you, member of oppositions. To close the debate in closing, I would like to welcome Government Whip. Here.
Check. Grieving is a process that is complex, that impacts individuals and how communities perceive it, right? But understand that it also comes with a delta, and that is that people have to move on. There will be process of moving on, and somehow it interrelated how much degree of love that I have for that person or that figure that minorities are very much inclined to. Obviously, the process of moving on will be different because we are debating not only on individuals to individuals level, but how in the communities perceive as an individual, such as Martin Luther, for example, that is very much impactful towards a certain communities, right? So let's go to OG then. Why does CG will inherently go above OG? I think that because CG is so, I think that OG is so best case, assuming that there will be a public pressure, but we neutralize it by saying that it's going to change other people's attitude towards that grieving person. But not only that, I think that CG's case is the prerequisite for OG's case to run. Why? Because regardless of society's acts towards these people who are grieving, our analysis is how will the individual journey will look like under the side. There is this say that opposition cannot win simply because they don't mechanize how will the process of moving on will look like. They're just assuming that one day it will subside, but not only that, process of moving on is something that is exclusive, that is CG and only experience, right? So let's go to the entirety case of opposition, right? First, with opening opposition. I think that opening opposition doesn't have the fiat to say that everyone will suddenly move on precisely because it is a perceive of a narrative or a narrative motion to begin with. But understand on the principle level, I'm going to flip it. When we are talking about how human experience are complex emotion, I'm going to flip this, being said that we have established, since it is different from each individual, since it will be perceived as a lifelong process that one must go through, then individuals, since it has different process, then at least in our side, it allows individuals to move on differently. But what is the delta? Moving on is a process that takes time. In opposition world, individuals would most likely to feel pressure to move on fastly, because there will be one day that CO never mechanized what will the day look like, when it will look like, right? Which most likely an individual will set a limit. What's the manifestation? Individuals will try harmful things in order to move on, i.e. taking away your loved one's picture, for example, or belongings, engaging in temporary activities activities. Further flipping CO's case about memory, right? That resulted in happiness, such as doing alcohol, drugs, etc., which are simply harmful even for individuals who died, because the memory of that person will be forgotten. But at least in our side of the house, when it is a lifelong process that one must go through, it allows individuals who are grieving and sad to think that it is a process that I have to prepare for it and seek a meaningful happiness during the process in order to move on, such as joining debate, for example, such as joining a lifelong process, such as working and into a big law firm, for example, right? On the practicalities, it will limit on when there's it, but it will limit the sadness in opposition and will increase the level of sadness in government. I don't think that sadness should be even the delta of this debate. Why? Individuals will still sadness anyway in both sides of the houses. It is a natural reaction when individuals are losing their loved ones. But what's the difference? The level of sadness is different in each timeline, right? We argue that the level of happiness, the sadness, would be different throughout the journey that one must go through. The difference is that in our side of the house, when individuals who just experience grief has the reality check that, hey, it's going to be a lifelong process that I must go through, then there will be a rational calculus for that individuals to process that sadness. Assuming in our worst case scenario that individuals in our side experiencing sadness all the time, but we think that sadness isn't the only way that these individuals will feel during their journey. In our side, individuals can still feel happiness throughout the activities. And we think that sadness oftentimes manifests into remembering the memories of your loved ones, direct engagement to CO as well. Why is it not harmful? It oftentimes becomes a driving force for vulnerable actors to do a movement or action towards the change for the better, i.e. the Black Lives Matter movement. That's the byproduct of the sadness and the grieving of African American communities after the death of George Floyd, precisely because they feel that I have a moral obligation to have a journey to remember the loved ones that I have just been died by the police, for example, right? I.e. on the idea of humanizing human. I don't think that individuals who are easy to move on or move on already is the actor that we have to weigh in this debate. Why? Because these individuals would most probably experience cognitive dissonance in the end of the day. Because once people are move on, they would probably forget about the narrative or that happens status quo. But remember, I think that member has established what is the framework for these individuals who are already moving on, right? So therefore, I'm not going to continue to that. So let's talk about entirety of CO's case. I don't think that CO's case is very much best case and no picturization of what will that one day will look like and or who sets the cap or this particular day, right? But I'm going to flip this and engaging to accessibility. Individuals has the rationale to think in our side of the house that their journey contains a lot of emotions and feelings such as happiness, sad, anxiety. Being strong is not the prerequisite for people to go into journey, right? I think the prerequisite is that it is the readiness and the rationality that at least it is going to be hard, but I have to experience it, right? But even if it has to be strong. But we think that there will be support coming from the people because when you see someone experiencing a process, obviously there will be an empathy for people to actually support that particular person, right? Clearly, because not everyone has a strong mental health, it will be better to treat it as a process that one must go through because it allows people to accept their bad days in the end of the day. But on the idea of process of memory, when they say about subside means initial response to a good thing, that's not exclusive because individuals, when they rejoice the memory, they would most likely to be sad and also have the sense of enjoyment. But what's the difference? It's the act towards that nostalgic feeling. In our side, since it is process, their person would most probably feel, my dad want to see me in NUDC semifinal. Now I want to achieve that particular goal, for example. In your side of the house, when you see that particular memory that somehow my dad want to be in NUDC, for example, then most probably you will say, okay, it's just a memory. I would not act towards it, right? Because there's no pressure coming whatsoever from their side. But idea on the satisfaction or policy that somehow minorities are going to be obliged, I think that minorities live differently. Regardless of this narrative, minorities are being oppressed. At least it's a form of change, it's a form of act, right? So what's the comparative then? We think that in an emotional state, the harm is asymmetrical. Why? When people perceive something as an emotional state, it will transform into a virtue. And therefore, people will perceive it as a norm. Why is this bad? In opposition, when people or individuals are dealing with someone who are grieving, since this is perceived as something that is one day will subside, then there's no incentive for them to help these grieving individuals. In comparison to government, since people perceive it as a process, since it is a verb, then both people who are grieving and people surrounded will have the guts and the reality check that, hey, grieving is indeed often painful or sad, but at least I will go through with it. And buckle up up for a lifelong process that I will experience. But what will be the manifestation? We think that it will be a process of moving on and will be much more meaningful, having a new hobby, exploring new activities, and rejoice the memory. In comparison to opposition, where the journey will be that one day will subside, no mechanization coming from both the opposition bench. Very proud to be in the semifinal.
Thank you, Government Whip, for that speech. To complete the case in closing opposition, I'd like to welcome Opposition's Whip. Here.
Before I start, all I'm saying in this debate is purely for debate purposes, and especially for my parents. Sorry in advance. Three points of clarification before I move on to my engagement. Firstly, this house prefer a world motion, meaning under the world's manual that the government side have to reset a world to create a new world that is where grief is perceived as a lifelong process to begin with. Therefore, they have no fiat on the status quo benefit that are already happening in status quo. They have to prove it. Secondly, the world under government bench will look like where everyone must go face this grief as a lifelong process. Therefore, grief will be something that is normalized, and the society in general would be numbed by grief because you are not allowed to show your emotion, as Jose already said before. And thirdly, when will one move on to begin with under our side in status quo? Well, it is something that is unpredictable because it is something that is subjective. People go through their pace, people go through grief at their own pace. So I don't think it is necessary for us to predict when will everyone move on to begin with, or even if they will move on in the first place, we will prove why it will okay if no one move on to begin with. Let's start by engaging with CG. Their identity is that micro impact, that on an individual level, you are likelier to move on to begin with. Three problems with this. Firstly, Jose already explained that you will face the gaslighting and tiger parenting. You will be raised in a toxic mentality since you are still young. This make your case cannot run because one, this gaslighting and whatnot will be faced by you in your formative years. Your memory of this will stay throughout the lifetime. Secondly, there is always an external threat from your parents and your society to judge you, to make sure that you are not showing your emotion, or unless you get whooped by your parents, for example. But thirdly, even if you are mature and independent, those memories will still be ingrained, makes you expressing your feeling seems unnatural. That is why when I lose Alsa UI last year, I cannot even cry, even though I'm alone and the most remote part in FHUI, because I keep hearing my parents saying that, oh, it's just a competition. Gak usah lebay. Don't hyperbolizing yourself. This is important because grief is when you are at most irrational state. You cannot think and you cannot make the best decision for yourself. Therefore, when you are at this state, you don't want your pent-up trauma, you don't want your past worst memories to take the wheel to begin with, and therefore it will not happen under their side. But secondly, even if it will not happen, the macro policy will always affect your personal way of grieving, because one, it will affect the norm that you are going to be familiarized within the society to begin with. Therefore, you are still going to be affected by whatever everyone went through, because you want to be the part of the in-group, you don't want to be the odd one out to begin with. with. But secondly, the manifestation of this norm, as Jose already said, is the policy, like the bigoted ones, like hating on the dead guy. This is important because it will make move on less likely, as Jose already explained before. The prerequisite for you to be able to move on is to enjoy your past memory, to laugh at your past memory in and of itself, so that you are able to enjoy those past rather than keep stuck in sadness to begin with. But thirdly, even if you don't move on, take them at their best. Even if you are failing to move on under their side, we don't really care. It's a good thing because one, it is your motivation to begin with. This is proven by Rama himself, showing that, oh yeah, he want to be in NUDC Grand Final, for example, so that he will be able motivated. Or by the example of social movement itself. It is the exact thing that fueled the social movement to begin with. You are using your anger because of your loss, because you want to create change. George Floyd did not die in vain exactly because people cry on the street. People are marching and mad because of the racial injustice in the United States to begin with. Therefore, it is the motivation to begin with. So the weighing is that even after all of their benefit is still able to be co-opted, which makes their benefit not exclusive at best, but with the harm that I already explained and Jose already explained before, not moving on will be worse under the government wealth rather than on our side. Therefore, we are still providing a better circumstances to begin with. Secondly, let's move on to OO. Why CO is over OO to begin with? Because people will, because their identity is that people will judge on government, people will be respectful on opposition, but they don't explain why it will happen to begin with. This explanation only exists with Jose saying that the constant gaslighting for everyone will be happening since they are young. This is important because one, you will be raised in a constant state of toxic masculinity. Parents will be ashamed to raise a crybaby, for example. Parents will be ashamed of raising people who are crying every time they lost in Olympiad Science SD, for example. Secondly, your community and society will feel numb at those grief because they will force to exaggerate the bad memory in and of itself. So they don't really care about those people who are already dying. They don't care about grief anymore. Therefore, they won't care about your own grief. There will be no support system. And thus, thirdly, even after all that, if you are still showing grief in a long time, therefore, the judgment will only happen in society. This layer is only brought, this layer, the third one, is the only one who brought by OO, which makes the analysis, the previous two one who is brought by Jose, is the prerequisite, prerequisite of their harm happening in the first place. So, but still, we still manifest the unfairness by explaining the birth lottery and the policy impact to begin with. So the weighing is that the judging will only happen if you are gaslighted to begin with. Therefore, our case is the prerequisite of OO and provide more certain impact and the trickle-down effect, not only just grief, but you cannot express your sadness in losing competition, for example, worse of emotional state after all. Lastly, OG. Their problem is regarding social stigma. This case won't work because one, this is this house prefer a world motion, so you must imagine a new universe, no fiat on status quo benefit. But secondly, society won't judge you already in status quo. That's why I already bring those POI to begin with. The fact that you won't judge me to begin with if I cry right here, right now, shows that your benefit is something that is not exclusive. In fact, exactly because of this, there will be bigger societal stigma on government because people will be forced to have strong mentality. The pain and the trauma will be built up for everyone. Hence, the risk of relapse is much more dangerous, and you are condemning everyone to a painful and traumatic childhood. Oppose.
Thank you, Opposition Sweep, for that speech. That's marked the end of the open semi-final round. Thank you so much, everyone, for a great debate. Yeah, you can give applause for every teams here. And everyone can just go to the auditorium for waiting for the announcement while the judges will discuss and using this room.